All right, so today we're looking at something that might seem a little dry at first glance. Standardized tests. You know, those things we all probably have some love-hate memories about.
Yeah, not exactly light reading.
But as you always remind me, data can tell some fascinating stories, and you've brought in a real gem, a post-mortem analysis of an English language exam from Malaysia.
I think you'll find this one pretty interesting.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, what exactly do we mean by post-mortem in this context? It's not like we're dissecting, well, an actual test.
Right, In this case, it's more like a deep dive, a thorough review of the exam after it's been taken.
Mhm.
Looking at things like the overall pass rate, any patterns in student performance,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
So like an autopsy, but for an exam, trying to figure out what happened, where things went well, where they maybe didn't.
Exactly. And this particular report comes from SMK St. Mary in Kuala Lumpur, which gives us a really interesting window into a specific school within the Malaysian education system.
Speaking of windows, this report was originally written in Malay, which I found really interesting. What do you think that tells us about who this analysis was intended for?
That's a great observation. It definitely suggests a local audience, right? Teachers, administrators, maybe even parents. Like this was meant for internal analysis and improvement, not necessarily for a global audience.
That makes it even more fascinating. We're getting a glimpse into their own internal process here. So give us the big picture. What were the overall results like?
Well, they focused on the Form 1 English results. That's roughly equivalent to ninth grade in the U.S. system. 239 students took the exam, and the overall pass rate was 93.07%.
That sounds pretty good on the surface.
It does, and there's always but with these things, the report also highlights that nearly 7% of students didn't pass. And
Mhm.
they really dig into the data on that.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting for me. They actually list the names of each student who failed.
They do. It shows you the level of detailed analysis here. It's not just about the big numbers, but also looking at individual student performance. And it's not just a list, you know. You were talking about the diversity of names earlier. It really stood out to me, too.
It really did. This mix of Malay, Chinese, Indian names, it's like a little snapshot of Malaysian society right there on the page.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And that cultural blend, I mean, it makes you wonder if it plays into some of the areas where students struggled. Because the report does highlight those.
Right, like those classic language learning hurdles. Multiple choice questions, they mention uh, error corrections, information transfer.
Those are tricky for any language learner at that age.
Oh,
But they're also, well, they're like little clues. They can tell us something about how language is being taught and learned.
how so?
Well, take those multiple choice questions. They're tough because they often rely on implicit knowledge of grammar, vocabulary, things students don't always realize they need to know.
So it's not just about recognizing correct grammar, it's about understanding why and how to use it in different situations.
Exactly. And English, let's be honest, it's got a lot of those why moments. Lots of exceptions and rules that make it tough to master.
And then add in the pressure of a standardized test. Knowing the rules is one thing. Applying them perfectly when the clock's ticking, that's another story.
It is. It is. Even the most confident English speaker can trip up in that kind of setting.
Okay, so we see the challenges, but what I'm curious about is what do they suggest doing about it? The report, it has this whole section on strategies problem solving, right?
It does, and that's what I really like about this. It goes beyond just pointing out the problems.
Yeah, it's like they're really trying to equip the teachers with ways to tackle these issues head on.
And not just a one-size-fits-all approach either.
Right, I noticed they emphasize things like really understanding the instructions, not just glossing over them,
Making sure that foundational grammar is solid.
and even using the right format, which, sometimes we forget those little things matter too.
They even talk about question-specific answering strategies.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like they want students to think critically about the exam itself.
Not just the content.
Exactly. It's like, okay, you need to know this stuff,
Yeah.
but you also need to know how to use what, within the framework of the test.
So it becomes a skill in itself.
Exactly. And that kind of strategic thinking that can be applied well beyond just exam taking.
Absolutely. So we've got the data, we've seen the challenges, and they've even given us some potential solutions.
Right.
But now I have to ask, what's the takeaway here for our listeners? Why should we care about this English exam in Malaysia?
It's easy to get bogged down in the specifics, but zoom out for a second.
Okay, zooming out.
This points to a much bigger picture about how much emphasis is placed on English language skills in their education system.
Which makes sense, right? Malaysia's a globalized country.
Wow.
English is widespread. It opens doors.
Exactly. And for these students, this exam, it's not just a grade.
Right? It's their future we're talking about.
It can impact their opportunities for higher education, maybe even their career paths down the line.
So this one exam, as stressful as it probably was for them, it represents the stepping stone to a much wider world.
It really does. And I think that's something we often overlook, right? We see an exam, we see statistics, but we forget about the human impact.
Absolutely. And this report reminds us of that.
It gives us that snapshot, a glimpse into how high the stakes can be.
But it is just one snapshot, right? One school, one exam, 1 year.
Exactly. We can't extrapolate everything about Malaysian education from this.
But it's a starting point.
It definitely is, and it gets us thinking about the bigger picture of education, the different approaches, the challenges of language learning in a multicultural society.
And speaking of those challenges, there's this one detail in the report that really struck me.
Oh, yeah.
What's that?
They list the names of the students who were absent.
Oh, right. 8 students in total.
8 names just sitting there on the page, and it makes you think,
It does.
what were their stories? What kept them from being there that day? And how will those absences, whatever the reason might be, how will those affect their paths?
It's that reminder that behind all the data are real individual lives.
Exactly. And this report, it gives us a glimpse into a small part of that.
A moment in time frozen by this exam.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
Thank you, listener, for bringing in this fascinating report. It's given us a lot to think about.